Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Philosophy of in Eastern Europe podcast brought to you by the European Center for Philosophy of Culture. We would like to re-examine Eastern Europe from a philosophical perspective.
One can say that, given the current geopolitical and geocultural circumstances, this question was never more important than it is now. So, what is Eastern Europe? Where is it located? What are its distinctive axiological and normative characteristics? What is its significance for the European cultural project?
Today, we talk about the limits of Europe. It is a topic that has dramatically regained relevance considering the current geopolitical twists and turns, shifts and reorientations, as well as the persistent anti-European tendencies within European societies. It seems that the limits of Europe are shaking. There are more and more visible cracks in them. The question about the meanings and the general condition of the limits of Europe takes on a special significance when approached from the perspective of our region, Eastern Europe. The region that has been marginalized for centuries, separated from the core of the European community by a series of historical iron curtains, perceived and experienced as a worse Europe, now is gradually getting a position of a guardian of European borders. At the same time, it can be seen as a kind of a sensitive seismograph, measuring many decentralizing, subversive tendencies within the European cultural project. Our guest today is Dr. Laurynas Peluritis, philosopher and historian from the University of Vilnius, in Lithuania. He's an expert in social and political philosophy and a great expert in the history of dissident movements in Lithuania during the Soviet times. Laurynas, let me start with a very general issue. The question of geographical boundaries of Europe is open and debatable, and it is so for obvious reasons. Europe is just one of the subcontinents of Eurasia. If so, one can always find a set of criteria to set these boundaries there rather than here. For example, the line of demarcation between Europe and Asia for centuries, if not for millennia, was set on the Don River. It was a cartographer of the Tsar Peter the Great, Vasily Tatistchev, who in the name of the political interests of the Russian Empire worked out a set of criteria to move these boundaries to the Ural Mountains. It still took some time to recognize this extension of Europe, and it eventually, after many desperate political and financial efforts of Tsarina Catherine the Great, was acknowledged in the second half of the 18th century. This example already shows that while thinking about limits of Europe, we should turn to other set of criteria: political, social, axiological, religious, broadly cultural. So, metaphorically speaking, where lie the limits of Europe? What are the basic coordinates of our cultural geography?
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here in Warsaw. I think the question is very problematic if we look at how today's geopolitical thinking and geopolitical imagination of what are the perceived interests of states and so on. You could say that in a lot of ways, our political elites globally around the world have kind of returned to the ideas of late 19th century, early 20th century. So now we have mercantilism, protectionism, returned. We see clearly imperial ambitions of conquest once again being reestablished in many different ways. So this is troublesome in a very big way, but it also reminds that when we exactly ask the questions about what could seem a question about geography, it's actually a question about political ideas and broadly speaking of political imagination. Russia doesn't have to be in confrontation with Europe or with us, but it perceives that in their vision of reality, of imperial conquest and expansion, we are the enemy. It's not that we are objectively a threat to them in any way. We don't want to invade Russia. There's nothing for us to do there. Why should we? We have enough problems of our own as it is. But in their political imagination, we are also the enemy. So, but there is an element. There is a certain element of what we could say physical geography that has returned to politics. For example, who helps to protect and control sea lanes, trade routes? We are very much used to living in a very globalized world where we can, order something from China, from Taiwan, from Malaysia, and it will arrive by plane in a matter of days, by ship in a matter of weeks or months. But we are so used to this luxury, we take it for granted. But it's not for granted. Someone has to, protect trade routes from rogue states, from pirates, and so on. And this is not something that is just that we live in a somehow qualitatively different time of history where past problems have seemed to have disappeared. It's not. Just what there. A lot of countries, especially the United States of America, have expended a lot of resources to ensure globalization from an economic point of view to happen. So it's not something that just exists on its own. It's always needs a sustained effort for it to continue. So it reminds us that these sort of physical geography elements, they're still there, but of course the political imagination, what do we do with them, is also crucially important. Like, no one is planning to drive tanks to Moscow, but tell that to the Russian generals. Yes, so that's the kind of issue we can say broadly is going on. But if we would look at what Europe is, and I think it is a very difficult question to answer, I would say Europe is first and foremost a set of ideas. You can be European by not being geographically in Europe, and this, what is encompassed by this set of ideas, and we can see it's what we now would call Europe is of course very different what Greeks thought was what was Europe geographically or culturally, we could say now. And we could probably say that it emerged sometime in the late medieval ages as just the basic elements that later evolved to be what is modern day Europe. And a lot of course, transformations and bloody wars also shaped the course of our history and our continent, not just ideas. But I think a very good estimation of what's the beginning of not only modern European but probably modern Western civilization was given in Harold J. Berman's book Law and Revolution, where he discusses how what we think are sort of the basic ideas that we think now are sort of the rule of law, the importance of constitution and so on. He presents a very strong case that it's not just a continuation of Roman law. It's exactly a very peculiar case that in late 11th, 12th century, there is a beginning of reception of the Codex of Justinian, and first and foremost the digests, and then also there's commentary on it. But the context of the commentary is crucial because, well, first and foremost, most people who are into studying law, they're also in studies of theology. Most of them are also clergymen. Not all, but most of them. And also the establishment of universities, as we think of them now in Bologna and Paris, this study of Roman law was one of the first stimulus to formalize the course of studies and to expand it. But two other important elements was, of course, Christian theology and the new reception of ancient Greek philosophy. So texts by Plato, texts by Aristotle, their ideas become interpretative tools to not just repeat what's written in the Codex of Justinian, but to interpret it as a certain, not only legal system, but you could say a philosophical system. And I think what Berman, he of course is writing about law, but I think it's a very good approximation of what generally happens with these, it's a cliche when we say, that Europe or the West holds on three pillars. It's Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. But what Berman does, he shows concretely when this sort of connection between the three elements takes place. And of course, another big part of, and that's why I like this book, he also shows that, for example, secularization, the preconditions for it, to have secular culture, also is, from a standpoint of view of ideas and premises, is beginning to be established exactly in the medieval ages, not and only then developed in early and late modernity. So I think if we would look at it from a more historical point of view, we could say that what is Europe? It's a very complex set of ideas that happened in a very peculiar way of their mixing. Because, of course, Roman lawyers knew about Greek philosophy. And if you would look even at the late stages of the Western Roman Empire, there were Christians who were educated in Roman law. Or if we would look at Justinian, he was a Christian, and he ordered this sort of systematization of Roman legal documents and commentaries. And of course, he knew Greek. But this mixture between the three didn't happen. And the uniqueness of this mixture, of these specific elements, historically, I think is what helped to establish Europe. But I would very much agree with Jan Patočka, who says that Europe is first and foremost an idea, which he describes as the care for the soul and living in truth. And this is very difficult to say, in a very simple way. What does it mean to care for one's soul? Or what does it mean to live in truth? But I think that this sort of as a certain normative idea, it can be seen in all of the foreground of what we call the European cultural project and European civilization. Even if we would look at what legal scholars are doing, what philosophers are doing, what artists are doing, what even theological debates are about, you could say these are the sort of core driving questions. And maybe the bigger problem would be, for if we call ourselves European, not to lose these elements that Patočka so eloquently describes in his Plato and Europe.
Well, as you said, to speak about care for the soul, or to speak about living in truth, sounds very sublime and very nice. But at the same time, it is very difficult to interpret what exactly lies behind it. So my kind of a very quick follow-up question would be, if it is the case that, and Patočka is right, then what would differentiate us from the great tradition of Far East, like Buddhism, for example? I believe that they are also based on similar principles.
Well, I don't think that Patočka is fully right in the sense that he ignores, in my mind, that element of Rome and Jerusalem too much in the favor of Athens. But I think he's correct in grasping that what civilizations are based is on core principles and ideas. And so I think in this sense, he is true. But also we can look at, exactly into Buddhism, for example, also as an alternative way to ask the same questions, an alternative way to give answers to those questions. So, there's the thing is that probably what differentiates it is how we view what the soul is, what is the sort of what is the agency of the human person, and what sort of telos or goal you are following, and that's what differentiates Western civilization maybe from others. But it doesn't mean that their other civilizations aren't asking these questions or aren't giving answers to it. It's just the sort of proposed program of how to deal with these questions may differ.
So it seems that what you are saying is like the motivations are pretty much the same, but the content is different.
We're human beings after all, so I don't think that there's that much difference. Especially it's you can, when you're writing a textbook, it's easy to sort of coin these differences between peoples and cultures, but when you start to interact with them more closely, then you can see certain similarities as well. So I wouldn't just say that, well, we have nothing to do with the rest of the world, especially if we would look at how European civilization emerges. So there's influences coming from the East through of course through religion, how Christianity emerges, with the philosophical influences and civilizational influences. The Greeks don't come out of completely nowhere, ex nihilo, and so on. So there are common roots between I think all the great civilizations.
And I'm really tempted to pose one more small follow-up question. You spoke about at the beginning. You spoke about this change, this global geopolitical economic context, and now, as we speak, there is growing distrust between Europe and the US. But at the same time, there is a warming up of the relation between Canada and Europe. So my question would be, what is at the bottom of that? Perhaps there are some principles which are violated, and if so, which are violated in case of the US, and if so, then what makes Europeans upset with all these American shifts? Why we treat this situation as a violation of the basic principles of our culture?
I don't have a satisfactory answer to this question, but I think maybe certain things that have happened in the United States culturally started to separate it more and more from Europe. And you can see it in the way the American society thinks and politicians think about Europe. If we would look 100, 150 years back, most of Americans could trace their roots back to the European continent. That isn't the case now. A lot of them are of For example, various descent from Asian countries. A lot of them now trace their roots back to Southern or Central America. And so sort of the cultural makeup and the cultural imagination of the United States, the imagination of what we can call the Americana as a sort of collection of stories, has shifted away from the cultural connection with Europe. And I think in the case of Canada, it's not so much, especially, a very strong historically British and French influences, both in Canada, have anchored it culturally more. For us, it's more understandable in the way we perceive things. And I think America is probably developing a certain culture of their own for quite some time now. But especially if we would look, how integration into societies looks like in Europe and the United States of America. Europe is primarily, nation states where you have to you either adapt to the main culture or you isolate and enclose yourself in certain ghettos and live more in parallel with the majority of society. And in the United States, since it was founded by immigrants, and the immigration still ensures that the United States is growing as a country and is going to be one of the biggest countries probably at the end of the 21st century if the trends continue. We can say that they have a certain set of what can be broadly described as American culture or American cultures, but also it doesn't clash so much with the cultures that people bring inside. So it's this sort of how it's called a melting pot element is much more pronounced in America than in European countries, even though we would like to say we're very open, we're very tolerant, and so on and so forth. So I think these are the very big differences. And maybe here, from a demographical point of view, America may have sort of a leg up on the Europeans. It's easier for them to attract all the immigrants that they want to come to their country than it is for us.
Are you saying that it is very possible that America is leaving this European community? Because at the beginning you say that one does not have to live in Europe in order to be European, and is heading in a completely other direction, or not necessarily?
I don't think it's necessarily that, but there is a certain possibility. I think it's a bit too early to tell. Because I think if you would look at the foundation of the United States and why, for example, it fought the Civil War, why it engaged in both world wars and tried to ensure peace in Europe, that clearly was connected to those ideas and ideals that emerged first and foremost in Europe. And now I think there is a sort of potential for them to have another kind of transformation culturally. But I think it's too early to tell. Maybe there will be a very different shift, and we will see America more returning to worldviews and ideas that we in Europe are used to.
Okay, Laurynas, let's move to another general and fundamental, I would even say, topic. There is no doubt that the category of limits, our topic today, our subject is the limits of Europe. The category of limits has played a fundamental role in European philosophy and more generally in the history of European culture. In ancient Greek thought, it had acquired the status of one of the fundamental metaphysical, epistemological, ethical, normative principles. Correlatively, the very idea of limitlessness, accompanied by the idea of formlessness, was identified with darkness, monstrosity, evil in both metaphysical as well as ethical senses. This understanding of limits has undergone some changes in the course of European history. Modernity has introduced a significant shift here. It has partially maintained the ancient, largely positive account of limits At the same time, however, the moment of negativity has entered the stage. Limits are to be seen in terms of obstacles to be transgressed, but also in terms of possibilities. And yet, the fundamental orientational and normative significance of the category in question has remained uncontested. Now, at the boundaries of our region, there is a cultural formation built upon quite the opposite principle. Russia has no limits. How should we understand this slogan? What kind of cultural status should we ascribe to it? What implications does it have for both Europe, and here I mainly mean Eastern Europe, and for Russia itself?
It's a very interesting question. First of all, I would say probably the postmodernist critical project of modernity and exactly, of limits and so on, has intellectually failed, especially if we would look at how these ideas are taken up by Russian propaganda and ideologues who use, relativity, not, ideas, for example, that there's a relativity in values or preferences of, in human choices and political systems. They said they reconstructed this not into an argument for pluralism, but actually against. If anything is possible, then through sheer brutality and violence, we will make everyone believe in a certain set of ideas. There's no substantial difference from an ontological point of view, but then, practically that means since there's no normativity, we can then, enforce the sort of a set of, for example, fascist ideals. So I think what is impartially what's happening in Russia. Of course, it's more complex than that. But then returning to the questions that where political philosophy actually arises. It arises in the experience of the difference between different places. The sophists and first philosophers going around and traveling experience that, what we would describe as laws differ from region to region, from city to city. The customs of the Greeks and of the Persians, very different, wildly, one can say, yeah? So this experience, what the Greeks then described as the difference between nomos and physis of what is created by us, or in the Latin context of cultura and natura, as a sort of what is cultivated and created by human effort, and what exists naturally is one thing. But I think also a very deep and important category to have in mind here, and I remember the Romanian philosopher of history, Mircea Eliade, that there is a correlation also when we talk about the limits of the community, of the polis, especially in what he thinks was the case in the archaic period, is also the distinction between cosmos and chaos. Mm-hmm. That exactly the space where we live as human beings in a society, in a certain community, we have our laws, our nomoi, is a place of structure, of order. And exactly beyond those borders, there is danger and so on. And so if you could look in this way to what Russian propagandists and politicians are saying, that Russia shouldn't have no borders, it's exactly this kind of nihilism of destruction, which is well illustrated in how the Russian state functions. It's a state of lawlessness, which is based on violence. And so exactly they have chaos and they don't have rule of law. And I think this, when we return to these classical differences, it's also an interpretative tool for us to understand what exactly are we dealing with. But an interesting thing I've noticed even before 2014 or 2022, if you would engage with sort of cultured city folk from Russia, St. Petersburg or Moscow, and who would describe themselves as being very liberal and cosmopolitic, and you would ask them the question about borders. Of course, they have to get the Schengen visa to enter Europe and so on. They would say, I don't think there should be any borders. It's a free world, blah, blah, blah. But no, if you want to maintain rule of law, if you want to maintain human rights, those are, unfortunately, that is the reality, historically, and I think also philosophically, that they need to be established and defended. We like to go on about how human rights are inalienable, they're universal, and so on. But for them to exist as a practical reality, we need to enforce them. And so that means also having limits or having borders where we stop this enforcement, because you cannot just enforce it absolutely everywhere. We're limited as human beings, we're limited as political communities.
Okay, let's move to the. I believe this question can open a completely separate episode of our podcast series, but we are somehow bound by limited by time. So let's move to another question, and I believe the part of the things you were talking about will somehow return in the next question. Not this one, but the next one, the last one I prepared for you. So my next question would be as follows. Whenever I think about our region, Eastern Europe, in the context of the category, or through the lenses of the category of the limits, what comes to my mind are borderlands. Those specific spaces, cultural spaces, which emerge regardless of and across political borders. Spaces of coexistence of different ethnicities, religious denominations, and so on. Spaces built upon a common history and experience. This very phenomenon shows that culture, even though it, in my view, comprises politics, society, religion, can live and operate through different impulses and motivations. On the other hand, it is these spaces that have witnessed countless devastating and inhumane clashes throughout history. Laurynas, does the category of borderlands have any relevance for the contemporary cultural reality of Eastern Europe?
I think it has, but also, of course, I always, when we talk about borderlands in our context, I remember Timothy Snyder's idea of bloodlands. But of course, a big issue is that exactly external forces usually in our region have made it so that we are not only borderlands in many ways, a place where cultural exchange and plurality of religions, ethnicities, and worldviews coexist, but also turned it into bloodlands. And if we would look at the cultural, demographical landscape of our region at the beginning of the 20th century, and now we will find that exactly it has become more and more homogeneous. Why? Because of the Holocaust, because of various ethnic conflicts, ethnic cleansings, and great migrations that happened during World War II and right after it. And so it has greatly changed our region. It's now a lot more homogeneous than it used to be. historically. But it's not our fault that it happened this way. We must also remember it. That it was, external violent forces. And I think if we look historically into the countries of Polish Kingdom, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where, for example, if you would look at, for example, what was going on around in Europe, for example, to Jewish communities, and what was the situation for them here. Here very often they were invited as merchants, as craftsmen, to come and settle and live their way of life. Of course, we can say there was little integration or communication between various ethnicities, and later on it probably became a big problem with modern nationalisms emerging and so on. But also historically before, it was a lot more pluralistic and tolerant, you could say, in the old-fashioned negative sense of people tolerating each other's coexistence than many places in Europe. The big shame is, of course, with the political failure of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which of course was also a political entity for Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Ruthenians, all these various and smaller ethnicities also. With its seizure to exist, their fate also changed dramatically. But so I still think that when we think about borderlands now we maybe think it more in terms of us being at the frontier of Europe, at the frontier of what we call the European civilization, the European cultural project. The front line now lies in Ukraine. And a very interesting thing is that if you would look at, and it was noticed by the Lithuanian historian Alfredas Bumblauskas, that if you would look at the front line in Ukraine, the way it was from 2014 to 2022, it was, very close to three other geographical political coordinates from the past. One of them was of course, the Ukrainian Hetmanate, but also the influence of Jesuit education and Mohilas Academy in Kiev, and also the Jewish allowed settlement line which existed in the Russian Empire, because they weren't allowed to settle around the sort of central parts, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on. And there were if we would look at the geographical limits and the front line in Ukraine in 2014-2022, those four lines were very close to each other. There, basically by just across from Mariupol was, and so you can say that exactly these cultural phenomena. You think Jesuit influence in Ukraine is something distant, abstract, but probably these kind of things have ripples through our reality, which continue to shape it in ways we don't really fully reflect and understand.
Okay, let's move to the next question, the last one. On another occasion, you spoke in the context of Lithuanian philosophy, but also more broadly, about the value and the importance of cultural synthesis. And as I said, with this question, I believe there is the return to the topic of the previous one, but also the one in which you were talking about Russia. The current social, political, cultural reality of Europe is marked by the apparently insurmountable tension between, on the one hand, integration, and on the other hand, nation-oriented decentralizing tendencies. The idea that less than 2 decades ago still captured the imagination of philosophers. We are well on the way to the abolition of the idea of the nation state, to the full realization of the Kantian dream of federal Europe. Now seems to be far from realization, but I would even say glaringly naive. On the other hand, the brutal reality of the Russian attack on Ukraine has revealed an unprecedented degree of consolidation of European states and societies around the common values and ideals. But the question of cultural synthesis takes on real meaning when we are confronted with radical otherness. And precisely here lies one of the main predicaments of the contemporary Europe. It seems that it is no longer interested in otherness. It is slowly but surely reshaping itself into a kind of a cultural fortress. As for our region, one of the dominant images of it for centuries has been that of a bridge between the West and the East. Can we still think of it in this way? And more generally, does the idea of cultural synthesis still have value for the European project? But can we talk about the latter without the former?
These are very good questions, and going through them, I would start maybe from the very start and the very beginning at the same time. I think the debate between sort of federalists and nationalists, let's label them two sides, was wrong. Both sides failed to acknowledge the intellectual and historical, cultural, political issues for their cause. I think it's not the choice of either we have a federalized Europe or we have what's called Europe of nations, or you know, this disintegration of the European Union into, again, highly autonomous so-called sovereign states. This debate is based, in my mind, on a wrong presupposition and a wrong understanding of what sovereignty is. I would say two philosophers are guilty of it. One is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his concept not so much of popular sovereignty, but his idea that sovereignty is indivisible. You either have it fully or not at all. And another is, of course, a critic of the idea of popular sovereignty, the German, very highly controversial legal theorist Carl Schmitt, who is in his political theology sort of describes sovereignty as a certain power to make decisions, but also then views that all international law and agreements are limiting the power of sovereignty, and so any kind of transnational or international law is therefore a sort of a misunderstanding intellectually. I disagree with both of them, because I think if we look exactly at the history of our region, we would find that now, as nation states, we are more sovereign than ever, precisely because we are cooperating economically, politically, militarily, and so on. We still have always the option of the sovereign decision to leave the European Union, leave NATO, and so on and so forth, but we don't exercise it. Like even Orban's Hungary doesn't, with all the critique of the dictate of Brussels, usually they are calmed down by some European funds, and it's more calm for the next 6 months or so. So all of our countries are greatly benefiting from this interaction, because I think we must not mistake sovereignty with autarky or being completely autonomous. It's impossible, even for a country like Germany, France, Poland, to be completely autonomous from the world, not to trade, to make everything over here and so on, or to maintain the function of the economy of society without people coming in, immigrants who do a lot of work and so on. It's impossible to achieve that. And it's not even talking about smaller countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So for us, it's, impossible to exist isolated economically from the rest of the world. It could be possible, but it would be like going 100 years back in terms of living standards, technology, and so on. So, it's basically suicide. But I would say now we're, as states, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, we're more sovereign, because we get to sit at the table with the big guys. We have a voice in the international arena, especially when we cooperate. Our voices, our positions are heard, and not only our voices, but also, we pack a substantial punch, in terms of, for example, now helping Ukraine fight its war against invading Russia. So we have become more sovereign. The question of cultural synthesis, I think it's more complex. And here, when I talk about cultural synthesis, I'm referring to a Lithuanian philosopher of the first half of 20th century, Stasys Šalkauskis, who imagined cultural synthesis as a sort of specific mission, well, first and foremost for the Lithuanian nation and for the Lithuanian state. And his idea was that national culture is basically participating in universal human ideals, but giving it a concrete national form. And it's very simple. For example, we translate Plato from ancient Greek to modern day Polish. It's giving, a form which is national in the sense of national culture, of the modern Polish language, to a text that was written more than 2,000 years ago. So that's a very easy example, how what cultural synthesis is about in terms of contents. Of course, he talks about culture in two ways. A Herderian way, that's something that connects us, and a lot of, I think, what you described at in the middle of your question about, is Europe becoming this sort of cultural fortress? And I think if we just look at culture as something that we have in common, as Polish culture or even or Lithuanian culture or European culture as such, there is this risk that we just are conserving what is already created and then not moving anywhere forward. But Šalkauskis, when he talks about what modern national cultures are, says, well, this Herderian common culture is just a prerequisite. What we need is this more idealistic, or what Roger Scruton calls the Humboldtian version of high culture, is something that is universal and that needs to be cultivated and achieved. And I think this orientation towards the future, and that, what Šalkauskis thought was for the Lithuanian state, in order to establish itself at the beginning of the 20th century after World War I, and he's already thinking about cultural synthesis as World War I is raging around him, is to have a modern and relevant culture, so that when you have a interesting and open culture to the future, you can base a political project like the nation state on it. And I think this is one of the elements, if we would look at our sort of nationalisms and exactly this debate between the Eurofederalists and nationalists, is a very narrow imagination of what national cultures are, or what they could be. And Šalkauskis, of course, is looking at what the modern Lithuanian culture in the Lithuanian language was at the beginning of the 20th century, thought that exactly taking and borrowing elements from other cultures, from neighboring countries, is what needs to be done. You don't need to isolate yourself from Polish, German, or even he thought also Russian influences, but you need to take elements from them and give them a unique national, in Szalkowski's case, Lithuanian form. And of course, he practiced it himself with translation of texts of philosophical terminology into modern-day Lithuanian language. And this is something if we engage in cultural dialogue, if we engage in the act of hermeneutics, in the act of translation, Szalkowski would say we are engaging in the act of synthesis of different elements. And I think what we need to reestablish in the more common European project is exactly this orientation forwards, not what Europe is and has been historically. It's very nice to preserve old buildings, historical sites, elements of architecture, of culinary diversity of Europe, and so on. It is important, but also we need to return this element of looking forward, what Europe can or even should be. And I think this openness to transformation, again, would return to what Patočka is writing about Europe. This fundamental openness is a very big element in European culture. Not just preservation, but also looking forward. And I think if we would look then back to the question of, our region being between East and West, I think it, as a bridge, I think that politically this vision has clearly failed. But of course, then returning to Szalkowski's, when he was first writing about cultural synthesis, he exactly was writing about this being between East and West. And when he returned to this idea at the end of his life, he changed his lens and he started talking about cultural synthesis, not from being between East and West. And he said, well, Lithuania is in the West, not in the East, in his vision, or when he's writing it in 1938 at the end of his life. He says it's not between East and West, it's in the West. But the question of cultural synthesis is then exactly engaging the diversity and plurality of societies, cultures, ethnicities that exist in our countries. And I think when we now look at the questions of, for example, which are fairly recent in our region compared to Western Europe, for example, the integration of immigrants. One thing is, of course, that there is a certain minimum that they probably should learn about our languages, our customs, how our societies in general function. But of course, there's an element that they will want to keep as their roots and their identities. And if we respect human dignity and human, the idea of human agency and autonomy, it's of course natural then. But through the lens of cultural synthesis, if we look at our national cultures as not being something that is only to be preserved and conserved, but also as moving forward, then it would be a lot easier to attract people coming to our countries to join us, not only living in the same society economically, but also join us as in a broader cultural dialogue. And so I think this idea that we can reimagine cultural synthesis, not this debate that was in Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century, when one side was saying, well, we're between East and West and we should find a synthesis. And intellectuals like Felix Konechny saying, no, you have to choose. You're either or in the Latin civilization in the West, or you're beyond it, and just a mixture would only create chaos and so on. I think we're past this debate. But I think if we change the question, if we would look at the question of cultural synthesis, is not about influences coming from the outside. It's what we do with our cultures on the inside. And I think that is the real question when we try to think about cultural synthesis today. And I think it's a useful paradigm, you could say, that we can help us move out of this division, if either we have a united Europe or we have just these separate bickering nation states that always are dissatisfied with the neighbors, with the borders, the way they were drawn, and so on. And I so think this, more broadly speaking, this could be a chance for us to reinvent ourselves intellectually. And I think actually, if you would look, for example, of what modern Polish culture is, of course, it's very different from what it was at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's natural. And so we can then, naturally think, well, this change, of course, occurred, but it means that there's always this element of openness in our cultures. And so you didn't stop being Polish just because culturally the country has transformed. It's still Polish, it's different. You can trace a lot of things back, but this change and transformation and openness, it doesn't mean that you somehow lose who you are, as if having an identity is some kind of thing, like, you carry around a jacket and you lose it and you leave it somewhere. It's not like that. And so I think it's having identities, but also being open culturally is not a hard what's the word, dichotomy, that you have to choose either having your national identity or being culturally open. I think what the failure of exactly this European common European culture that will erase national cultures debate was absolutely wrong. It doesn't erase national cultures. And I think a lot of people now would feel that they have a national and also European identity, and it's absolutely normal. And I think this pragmatic way where we are now has shown that the intellectual debate had the sort of wrong lenses on it from the beginning. And I think now maybe is a good chance for us to rethink these categories that we try to describe our nation states and the European project in general.
After what you said, it seems to me that one of the main, if not the main, predicament of contemporary European culture, according to you, is its presentism. That we are too much concentrated on the present instead of being open to the possible futures of our continent. And another thing which I really liked in what you said is this possibility of cultural synthesis, which would be a synthesis of I'm not sure whether you would agree with me, but this is how I understood what you said. It would be a synthesis between two forms of nationalism. One based on the category of ethnic categories, and I believe there is no way to get rid of that at the point we are. But the other one is the kind of axiological or ethical, in a sense, derived from the word ethos. Did I understand you correctly that this is the chance for Europe for a cultural synthesis, new cultural synthesis, is to find a balance between these two forms of nationalisms, where none of them should not be treated too seriously?
Yes, I would agree, and I think you understood my point very clearly. I think another element to where we are now is the fact that not only do we have a chance, but I think that the pragmatics of the world that we live in has shown that these debates were ideological and not sort of based in what the cultural process was in our countries behind. For example, if you would look at the sociology in Lithuania, people would say that we're Lithuanian, but also we're Europeans. And it's not a contradiction. It's not a choice that you're either or.
But you know that Russians
Are not
used to say used to say the same.
Yeah, but Russians are not Europeans precisely because they do not participate in that axiological part of the European ethos. Maybe 200 years from now something will change, but I have little faith.
Let's hope for that. But I also do not believe in this scenario. But let's hope for that. Thank you very much, Laurynas, for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.